What's going on, guys? Tyler from Audioholics Anonymous here, and today I'm doing something very interesting. See, I happened across an article listing 10 essential power metal albums, or albums that are considered the most important in the genre. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun if I heard all of them and then shared my opinion on them on the channel? So I took it just a little further than that, and I watched just like a fair amount of videos, read some articles, looked at some discussions on social media, and through all of that, I compiled a list of 15 albums that were considered the most essential, that were argued to be the most essential, most mentioned albums of power metal history. And so I listened to all of them, and I will now give you my thoughts on them one by one, starting with Edguy, Mandrake. I think when you get to a certain level of quality within music, there's just a certain feeling that you get when you listen. It's hard to describe, but you can just tell that what you're listening to is something special. A masterpiece, if you will. It's something that rarely happens for me, but this is a feeling I got almost immediately with this record, and it only grew stronger the more I heard of it. This album blew me completely away. Out of nowhere. It was the last one I listened to on this list, actually, and you would think after 14 other power metal albums, it would be impossible for another one to blow my mind, for another one to surprise me, but you couldn't be more wrong. It's hard for me to explain why this album is as good as it is. We could talk about the amazing vocals, but we have that on a number of different albums on this list, maybe even some better vocals from bands like Iced Earth, Blind Guardian, and Symphony X, who we will all get to later. Spoilers. We could talk about the amazing instrumentation, but again, there's amazing instrumentation across the board on this list. So what is it about this one that stands out so much compared to the rest? Well, really it comes down to two things: style and songwriting. I think Edguy, at least on this record, has a complete mastery of the genre and thus can freely move between all kinds of different aspects of it. The ability to use all those tools have created the sound of this album, and they use it to great effect. Every single song on this album is a masterpiece. I mean that, I really do. I absolutely loved everything here. It was all so strong. The lyrics, the melodies, the guitar playing, the bass playing, the drumming, the vocals, the production. It was all perfect for this album. All the songs were super memorable. It was to the point where I was a little over halfway through the album and I simultaneously wanted to restart it and keep listening because I just loved what I was hearing so much. This album hooked me in the first 5 seconds, but it held my attention the entire time. It took me on a musical journey that kept things interesting and, more importantly, memorable. Easy to recommend this one. 10 out of 10 from me. Next we have Port Royal, Running Wild. This is like Ailstorm, but kinda taken seriously. I mean, as seriously as pirate metal can be taken. It's a pretty enjoyable record. Unfortunately, I don't have a ton to say about this one. Not that it's uninteresting per se, just that there's not a whole lot to talk about. The album is just a solid piece of metal, without many obvious flaws. But that is, in of itself, a flaw. It's inoffensive, but nothing really stands out musically aside from the pirate theme. Although, they make that theme an important aspect of the music as well as the lyrics, so you could easily argue that's enough to make the album unique and worth hearing. Ultimately, it's a fun album with well-done metal music, so I would still recommend it. I'm just not sure I would personally listen to it over some of the other ones on this list, and I'm sure some of the other ones that are out there. For me, this is a 7.5 out of 10. Next we have Something Wicked This Way Comes by Iced Earth. So, speaking of recording well-done metal music, here is Iced Earth. Iced Earth really naturally blends thrash metal and power metal in this album. And this album does indeed take a huge step in the power metal direction, whereas previous Iced Earth records were much more thrash metal focused. Of course, the next album, Horror Show, would go full-on power metal. But what keeps this album from that is it still has a lot of thrash metal to offer. There are some absolute headbangers on this record, to be sure. the absolute classic, Burning Times. The best song ever written about Jesus, in my opinion. Melancholy, Holy Martyr. Again, absolute headbangers like Disciples of the Lie and Stand Alone. And of course, the Something Wicked trilogy consisting of Prophecy, Birth of the Wicked, and The Coming Curse. Watching Over Me was another huge highlight for me. It's a song written about a friend of John Schaefer, who is the guitar player and the brains behind the band. That friend died in a motorcycle accident, and this is a song he wrote about that. I absolutely love it. It's a very emotional song, and I don't mind the religious connotations because the music is so well done and so emotive. The riffing on this album from John Schaefer is glorious, but the vocals from Matt Barlow are what really make this album. I think Matt Barlow is straight up one of the best metal vocalists of all time, and he does shine quite a bit on this record. The bass and the drums suffer a bit here, due to some members leaving between this album and the last, but it isn't terrible, and it's doable. It's serviceable. I think the album suffers mainly from having a few less memorable tracks, like Reaping Stone and Consequences. I don't hate Blessed Are You, but I certainly don't like it. It goes on way too long for what it is. I do recommend the record overall, though, but I would personally tell you, if you want to hear some really well done power metal, check out Horror Show. Or if you're in more of a mood for really, really good thrash metal, check out Night of the Storm Rider or Burnt Offerings. That's my suggestion to you. If you want something that's kind of, a jack of both trades, master of neither, you kind of get that with Something Wicked This Way Comes. And so I would give this album an 8.5 out of 10. Next we have Spartacus Visions. Now this is a very unique album. It's very ambitious music, and it all goes over very well. A lot of these albums are great, but this, much like Edguy's Mandrake, is a downright masterpiece. I was very impressed with this record on my first listen, and I have heard it several times since, and I'm sure I'll hear it many more times going forward. It just keeps getting better and better, frankly. Timo Kotipelto, excuse my pronunciation of these names, I'll do my best, is on lead vocals, and he absolutely fucking kills it. Jens Johansson is on keyboards and the harpsichord. His dynamic with virtuoso guitar player Timo Tolkki really make this album what it is. The songwriting is absolutely there on this record, don't get me wrong, and every track is amazing in its own right. But none of that would work were it not for the dynamic between Timo and Jens. Also, it's a concept album on Nostradamus, so there is that. Lyrically, it is very interesting. You need to check this album out, not just if you're a fan of power metal, but if you're a fan of neoclassical metal, if you're a fan of progressive metal, if you're a fan of metal, you need to check this album out. I give this a 10 out of 10. Fantastic album. Next we have The Keeper of the Seven Keys, Part 1 and 2 by Helloween. Alright. I'm going to talk about both of these albums at the same time, but I am considering them separate albums. I really enjoyed my time listening to these records. The first part I do slightly prefer, but both are still great records. The first album boasts of classic power metal tracks, such as I'm Alive, Halloween, Twilight of the Gods, and in my opinion, the second album doesn't have as many classic tracks, but it is still a great album, with songs like I Want Out and Eagle Fly Free. So this might be the part where I start losing people. I like these albums. I really do. I just don't, consider them masterpieces. They are far from the best albums on this list. It's not that they have huge glaring flaws or anything. I just think that, they might be a bit drawn out. The second album in particular. There are without a doubt some filler tracks on both albums. Other than that, I'd just say the songwriting isn't really there for a masterpiece level album, in my opinion. This is too amateur hour. I'm sorry, okay? It's still very influential and very important, both of them. I just personally don't see a 10 out of 10 here. The first album, I'll give an 8.5 out of 10, and the second album, I'll give an 8 out of 10. So you see, I still very much enjoy these records. They're still great records. I just wouldn't call them the best records ever made in the power metal genre. Next, we have Land of the Free by Gamma Ray, and this is very related to Helloween. Gamma Ray is the band that crawled out of the corpse of the classic Helloween lineup. And, you know, what I was talking about before, maybe this is a bit controversial to say, but I think I would pretty much take this album over both Keeper albums any day of the week. Everybody seems to think those albums should be considered the absolute essentials of the genre. And also, like I was saying before, I don't necessarily disagree with that sentiment. I just personally prefer this album. I think it's more or less the same sound and style, but it's more polished, it's more refined, there's more standout tracks. But take what I said about the Keeper albums and apply that here, because it is still kind of relevant. The album does drag a little bit, but there's still a lot of absolute bangers on here. Like I said, it's very, very similar music, and it's just slightly better made in my opinion. I give this album an 8.5 out of 10, the same rating I gave to the first Seven Keys album. Just notate here, I do kind of prefer this one. So next we have The Divine Wings of Tragedy by Symphony X. This album is a true masterpiece of progressive power metal. Symphony X were able to create an album full of absolutely classic and insanely well-written songs. Of Sins and Shadows is a heavy-ass intro to a great album with an equally amazing performance from Russell Allen, who puts in one of the best vocal performances of all time on this record. Michael Romeo's unique songwriting style and sound are present from the very first track and continue to be a highlight of the album the entire way through. Sea of Lies contains one of the best metal solos of all time in my opinion, and it's an absolutely killer track. The album continues to boast badass song after badass song. Out of the Ashes, The Accolade, Pharaoh, Eyes of Medusa, The Watching Hour, Candlelight Fantasia, and of course the fantastic and epic title track, The Divine Wings of Tragedy. What an amazing fucking record. Of course, it's an essential listen for any fan of the genre or anybody who's trying to get into the genre. Easily a 10 out of 10 for me. Next we have Valley of the Damned by Dragon Force. This is definitely not a bad album. I actually have a hell of a lot of nostalgia for this band, and this album as well. I personally prefer Sonic Firestorm, and especially Inhuman Rampage, but this is without a doubt the album most consider essential for the genre. The vocals from Z.P. Thiert, thunder, and soar over the incredibly speedy riffing from Herman Lee and Sam Totman. Some people consider Herman Lee a guitar player who is not as good as he sounds, but talking as somebody who has seen the band live, he absolutely fucking is. This man is incredibly talented and skilled at his craft. He's also very, very humble, and he often streams. It's interesting to watch him interact with people and with different musicians. You can really get a sense of the type of person Herman Lee is. He just wants to play music he enjoys. And so a lot of the hate that this band gets, I don't really think it deserves that hate. So as for the actual album, the title track on this record is an absolute classic of the genre, hands down. Blackfire is another standout, but the true masterpiece on here is Disciples of Babylon. That track is a 7-minute epic, and even gets a little proggy at times, which is really cool to hear. That said, some of the songs after that are rather forgettable and tend to run together quite a bit for me. Although there are no bad songs on this album, it is nearly an hour long, and I don't think it needed to stretch that much, as most of the memorable music is in the first half. You could have easily shaved 20 minutes from this record. Still, it's certainly fun to listen to, nonetheless. So I give this one a 7.5 out of 10. Next, we have Symphony of Enchanted Lands by Rhapsody. Rhapsody is one of my personal favorite bands in the genre. I absolutely love their sound. I love the way Fabio uses melody and feel to create something that sounds truly epic. This band seeks to be the soundtrack to your D&D session. The songwriting here is fantastic. The instrumentals across the board are fantastic. This is an amazing album. It's absolutely essential to the genre. I give this album a 9 out of 10. Next we have Nightfall in Middle-earth by Blind Guardian. So there were a few albums that blew my mind on this list, and this was one of them. It really took me a while to get into this one. I remember starting this album and getting a song or two in more than once, but it always seemed like there was a reason to turn it off. Well, I finally sat down one night and said, no, fuck you. I'm going to listen to the whole goddamn thing no matter what, and I'll follow along with the lyrics. So I'll follow the story and really put my whole focus into the music. Best decision I ever made. Holy crap. It's just, this album's amazing, guys. I could write a book to explain all the ways it works. All the reasons it is as good as it is. But seeing as we still have many albums to talk about, I'll abridge that book a little bit for your sake. Vocals from Hansi Kirsch are a big part of why this album is epic. Amazing, amazing performance from him. The instrumentals and song structures actually border on prog, but it never sounds too proggy or really at all like prog. This is a varied album with many different feels and textures throughout, and I loved every second of it. I love the heavy parts, the melodic parts, the epic parts, the slow parts. Everything about this album works. It also had the unenviable task of adapting Tolkien's The Silmarillion to music, and they totally pulled it off. This is the single best album ever written regarding any of Tolkien's works. Even the cover art is badass. Just check it out, people. Even if you don't like Tolkien, I'm confident the music will win you over. If it doesn't, then I don't know how you're listening to music with your head shoved that far up your ass, but you'd probably hear the music better if you took it out. 10 out of fucking 10. Listen to this amazing record. Next, we have Glory to the Brave by Hammerfall, and people really seem to dig this one. Can't say I know why. I don't think it's bad, but aside from the title track, this album just isn't very memorable. It's kind of generic. It doesn't really stand out in any meaningful way. The title track is certainly the standout track, like I said, but I still don't really like it. There's just something missing on this record for me. This is a very generic sounding power metal album in my opinion. I have heard it twice, and I really don't remember any part of this album that I think is all that enjoyable. It's not an entirely bad record, just most definitely not a good one. The one good thing I can say is that the performances are pretty good on their own. Maybe one of the other Hammerfall albums is better, but as far as this one goes, it's not really all that great. I don't recommend listening to this one, especially when compared with pretty much any other fucking album on this list. 6 out of 10. So next we have Crystal Logic by Manila Road. This record surprised me. Talk about criminally underrated. The epic Necropolis alone is worth the price of entry. Awesome, heavy metal riffage with vocals that stand out in the power metal genre as being somewhat traditional. I'm not really sure what this album is about, but the lyricism is pretty good, and it goes very well with the feel of the band, so maybe one of the most solid pieces of music on this list. I absolutely totally recommend it. 8.5 out of 10. That brings us to Marching Out by Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force. Yngwie Malmsteen. He's always been a guitar player that I have a love-hate relationship with. I don't necessarily enjoy the 3 million notes per second soloing style that he uses, but I tend to really enjoy his riffing capabilities. I have historically enjoyed every Yngwie album that I've heard. That said, I never loved any of them. Never really returned to them. Didn't regret listening to them, but not something I really wanted to come back to. That is, not until this one. I actually loved this album quite a bit. I thoroughly enjoyed this record the entire way through. Disciples of Hell is the highlight for me, but I also loved Soldier Without Faith, I Am a Viking, Anguish and Fear, Don't Let It End, and of course more. A great deal of standout tracks that I find myself returning to quite a bit. It's a consistently great album, but that works to its detriment just as much as its benefit. There's nothing even remotely subpar here, but there's also nothing that completely blows me away either. And I think what this album is missing is that one big track that keeps you coming back to the album over and over again. Better albums have that song, and so it has to be docked points due to that flaw. That said, I still fully recommend listening to it. 8 out of 10 from me. Finally, but definitely not leastly, we have Holy Land by Angra. This album was incredibly unique and interesting for the genre on the table today. This album, by far, had the most progressive metal elements to the style in the album, and it was absolute musical bliss the whole way through. This was actually one of my favorite albums on the list. Just amazing musicianship and songwriting. Compositions were very well done. I loved the riffs and the varied ways the guitar was used. In fact, every instrument was used in a versatile way on this album. This was a very dynamic album as well. It would sound very good on vinyl. I loved the influence taken from Brazilian music on this record, and that aspect added a certain flavor to the music that set it apart from the other albums on this list. That unique influence makes this a must-listen for me. Alright, and that brings our video to a close today. That has been 15 power metal albums that are considered the most essential. You know, listening to these records was a lot of fun, and it really showed me that there's a lot of variety in the power metal genre. I truly recommend exploring the genre for yourself and listening to most, if not all, of these albums. And of course, to continue to explore the other amazing bands within, such as Gravedigger, such as Sabaton, such as Camelot. So many great bands that didn't make the list today. And of course, to go back and look at the roots of the genre, such as Manowar, Rainbow, Dio, to go back and look at those bands and really understand that power metal exists because of them. So, yeah, I don't really have anything else to say today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that you learned something. I hope that I've introduced you to some new music that you can check out. And I hope you've had a good time. So, without further ado, I bid you adieu-do. Bye, guys!